Welcome, friend. I'm glad you're here. Tonight we'll leave the noise of the day behind and wander into a place where time moves a little slower. A place filled with quiet people, gentle stories, and peaceful journeys. So take a slow breath. Let your shoulders relax. And together, let's open the quiet atlas and discover where tonight's story begins. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd like you to imagine the sound of the sea. Not rough, not angry, just steady. The kind of waves that have been meeting the same stretch of shoreline every day for hundreds of years. Imagine cool air drifting in from the water, carrying the faint scent of salt and weathered stone. Somewhere in the distance, a lone gull calls once before disappearing into the evening sky. The sun is beginning to settle lower, painting the horizon in soft shades of amber and deep blue. Ahead, standing quietly upon the cliffs, is a lighthouse. Its lantern has welcomed weary sailors home for longer than anyone can remember. Tonight, that same light will guide us into our story. Along the northern coast, where the sea met weathered cliffs, stood a lighthouse called Northwatch. It had watched over these waters for longer than anyone in the nearby villages could remember. Long before today's fishermen learned the names of the tides, long before the oldest cottages found their place along the harbour, the light had already been shining. Every season left its mark upon the cliffs. Spring brought tiny wildflowers, clinging bravely to the rocky earth. Summer painted the sea a deeper blue and filled the air with the distant cries of nesting gulls. Autumn carried cool winds across the northern waters, bringing with them the scent of salt, rain, and cedar drifting from the forests inland. Then came winter. The sea never truly slept, but in winter it seemed to breathe more slowly. Snow gathered quietly upon the cliffs. Ice traced delicate patterns across the lighthouse windows. Even then, the light remained. Every evening, without fail. Perhaps that is why the people in the nearby villages rarely spoke about Northwatch. Some things become so dependable, so constant, that we stop noticing them, like the moon, or the changing seasons, or the quiet comfort of knowing someone is keeping watch while the rest of the world sleeps. There were children who grew into grandparents without ever remembering a night when the lighthouse had gone dark. It simply belonged, as natural and as familiar as the sea itself. If you stood quietly enough, you could hear the waves speaking to the cliffs, not in words, but in rhythms. One wave arriving, another returning, over and over for centuries. The cliffs never hurried the sea, and the sea never hurried the cliffs. Together, they had discovered something the rest of the world often forgets. There is no need to rush what was always meant to arrive in its own time. Perhaps that is why Northwatch always felt peaceful. Nothing there seemed eager to become something else. The stones were content to be stones. The sea, content to be the sea. The lighthouse, content to stand just as it always had, watching, waiting, guiding. Every evening there came a quiet hour when the world seemed to slow, almost without anyone noticing. The fishermen had already begun steering their boats toward the harbour. The village chimneys welcomed their first ribbons of smoke into the cool evening air. The gulls grew quieter, content to let the sea finish the day's conversation. The wind softened. The waves became longer, steadier, more patient. It was neither day nor quite night, just a gentle space between the two. If you had stood upon the cliffs, you might have noticed how the lighthouse changed during this hour. The old stone walls caught the last warmth of the sun, glowing softly against the cool blue of the sea. The windows reflected the evening sky like tiny mirrors, holding on to the final light of the day. It was a beautiful time to be alone. Not lonely, just alone. There is a difference. Perhaps the sea understood that better than anyone. It never hurried toward tomorrow. It simply welcomed each wave exactly as it arrived. And perhaps, without realizing it, the keeper of Northwatch had learned to do the same. His name was Elias. Morning never arrived all at once at the lighthouse. It came in gentle stages. The darkness softened to deep blue, then blue gave way to pale silver, until the first warm ribbons of sunlight slipped across the sea and found the weathered stones beneath Elias's window. He had always believed the morning deserved patience. There was no need to rush a sunrise. By the time he opened his eyes, the lantern above had long since gone dark, having faithfully guided another night's travellers through the shifting waters. Outside, gulls had already begun their familiar conversations, their distant calls carried inland by a breeze scented with salt and wild grasses. Elias smiled before he ever rose from bed. It was the same smile he had worn for years, not one born from excitement, but from quiet gratitude that another morning had found its way to the little lighthouse by the sea. His slippers waited exactly where he had left them. So did the wool sweater draped across the chair beside the window. Some people might have called such routines ordinary. Elias thought of them as dependable. He folded his blanket neatly, opened the window just enough to welcome the cool morning air, and paused, as he always did, to watch the sea. It was impossible to look at the ocean for 50 years without learning that no two mornings were ever truly alike. Some arrived wrapped in mist, Others shimmered beneath cloudless skies. Today, the water looked like brushed glass, disturbed only by a handful of seabirds skimming its surface in search of breakfast. "Looks peaceful today," he murmured to no one in particular, or perhaps to the lighthouse itself. The kettle took its usual place upon the small cast-iron stove. Before striking the match, Elias reached into the cupboard. His fingers stopped, almost without thinking. 2 mugs. They still rested side by side on the shelf. One deep blue, one soft cream. For just a moment, his hand lingered between them. Then, with the smallest smile, he lifted only the blue one. It had taken him years to stop reaching automatically for both. Even now, old habits occasionally returned before memory gently reminded him otherwise. The cream-coloured mug remained where it had always been. He had never considered putting it away. Some things did not need to be used every day to belong exactly where they were. As the water slowly warmed, Elias opened the kitchen door leading to the narrow garden that wrapped around one side of the lighthouse. Wildflowers nodded gently in the morning breeze. Blue lupines, white daisies, lavender that somehow thrived despite the salt carried in from the sea. Visitors often complimented the little garden. Elias always thanked them. In truth, he had never considered it his. He never mentioned that every flower growing there had first been planted by Anna. She used to laugh whenever someone claimed nothing beautiful could grow so close to the ocean. "Then we'll simply have to prove the sea wrong," she'd say. Even now, decades later, the garden seemed determined to keep helping her win that argument. Every spring, Elias carefully pulled the weeds, turned the soil, and watered each flower before tending to anything else. Not because the flowers demanded it, because promises sometimes bloomed in unexpected ways. The first task of every morning was never the lantern. It was the garden. Elias often liked to imagine Anna teasing him about that. "The ships can wait another few minutes," she would say. "Flowers are far less patient." He smiled to himself as he knelt beside the narrow stone border that separated the garden from the cliff's edge. The earth was cool beneath his fingertips, still holding the night's dampness. A few stubborn weeds had appeared since yesterday. They came every spring with remarkable confidence, as though convinced this year might finally belong to them. Elias gently loosened them from the soil, careful not to disturb the roots of the lavender growing beside them. "Not today," he whispered with quiet amusement. The breeze carried the familiar scent of rosemary and salt across the hillside. Anna had insisted on planting rosemary near the kitchen door. "Every home should smell like someone lives there," she would say. Even after all these years, brushing against its soft green branches released the same comforting fragrance that once drifted through open windows while she baked fresh bread on rainy afternoons. Elias closed his eyes for just a moment. Memory, he had learned, rarely knocked. It simply arrived through the smallest things. A familiar scent, the sound of a kettle, the warmth of morning sunlight resting on old stone. It simply sat beside you for a while. Elias opened his eyes once more and looked toward the sea. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another morning was beginning for someone else. He found himself hoping it would be a gentle one. Then, carrying his tea, he made his way toward the lighthouse stairs. By the time the tea had finished steeping, the lighthouse had fully awakened. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching tiny specks of dust that floated lazily through the quiet rooms. Elias carried his mug upstairs, one careful step at a time. 50 years had taught him exactly which floorboards preferred to creak, and which stair near the top asked for a slightly wider step. Visitors sometimes joked that he knew the lighthouse better than he knew himself. Elias always chuckled politely. Secretly, he thought they might be right. Every scrape along the handrail, every weathered stone, every brass fitting polished smooth beneath decades of steady hands, he remembered them all. They had grown older together. On the second landing, he paused beside a narrow wooden doorway. Tiny pencil marks climbed one side of the frame. Most had faded. Some had nearly disappeared beneath fresh coats of paint. But Elias had always painted around them. He carefully traced the tallest mark with one finger. Thomas, age 12. The handwriting belonged to Anna. Every birthday, she would stand the boy against the doorway, while pretending the pencil somehow tickled more than it did. Thomas always laughed. He would stretch onto his toes when he thought neither of them were looking. Elias always noticed. Anna always pretended not to. "You'll grow soon enough," she'd tell him with a smile. "No need to borrow tomorrow." Elias found himself smiling at the memory. It had been 22 years since Elias had last seen his son. 22 birthdays, 22 winters, 22 springs that had quietly arrived without asking permission. Time, he had learned, moved strangely after loss. Some years seemed to disappear as quickly as a passing tide. Others lingered, stretching themselves across the heart until they felt impossible to measure. He often wondered where Thomas might be, whether he still preferred his tea with cream, whether the streak of curiosity that had carried him beyond the lighthouse had ever settled into something resembling home, or whether he still found himself looking toward the horizon, wondering what lay beyond it. Elias hoped so. Curiosity had always been one of Anna's favorite things about their son. "He'll see more of the world than we ever will," she used to say with quiet certainty. Elias had smiled then. He still smiled now. She had been right. He rested his fingertips once more against the faded pencil mark bearing Thomas's name. The wood had grown smoother over the years, softened by time and careful coats of paint. Every mark remained exactly where Anna had drawn it. Every birthday still lived upon that doorway. He had often considered sanding the frame and starting fresh. Each time, he found himself setting the sandpaper back on the shelf. Some things were not meant to be made new. Some things deserved to grow old exactly as they were. Outside, a breeze slipped through the open window at the end of the hallway, carrying with it the distant cries of gulls circling above the shoreline. Elias took one last sip of his tea. It had grown comfortably warm rather than hot. He didn't mind. Tea, like mornings, was never meant to be hurried. He smiled toward the little doorway one final time. "I hope you've seen beautiful places, Thomas," he whispered. The words drifted softly into the quiet house. No answer came. None was expected. Some thoughts were simply meant to be spoken aloud. He set his empty mug upon the windowsill and rested his hand briefly against the weathered wall. The lighthouse had been his home for 50 years. It had witnessed laughter, birthdays, storms, silence. It had held every joy and every sorrow without asking for anything in return. Tomorrow, as always, there would be flowers to tend, windows to polish, a lantern to prepare before sunset. There was comfort in knowing exactly what the day would ask of him. With one last glance toward the sea beyond the window, Elias picked up his mug and quietly made his way toward the spiral staircase. There was still work to be done.
The spiral staircase wound upward through the center of the lighthouse, just as it had every day for the past 50 years. Elias climbed without hurry. The steps knew his pace by now. Each one answered beneath his boots with a familiar creak, as though quietly announcing his arrival to the rooms above. He rested one hand upon the smooth wooden railing. It had once been darker in color. Time, countless mornings, and the touch of steady hands had polished it into something softer. Some people believed old buildings slowly wore away. Elias had always thought they simply remembered. The higher he climbed, the brighter the morning became. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows carved into the stone walls, laying warm bands of light across the worn steps. Dust drifted lazily through the quiet air. Nothing here ever seemed to be in a hurry. Halfway to the lantern room, Elias paused beside a small window overlooking the eastern shoreline. The tide was making its patient journey back toward the sea. Fishing boats rested in the harbor below, their masts swaying gently like tall reeds stirred by the breeze. A few gulls circled overhead, already busy discussing matters only gulls could understand. Elias smiled. They do enjoy holding meetings. The birds paid him little attention. He found that perfectly reasonable. Setting his empty mug upon the windowsill, he looked toward the distant horizon, where the sky met the sea in a line so soft it almost disappeared. Somewhere beyond that horizon, people were beginning ordinary mornings of their own. Children getting ready for school, bakers pulling warm loaves from their ovens, shopkeepers unlocking front doors, fishermen preparing their nets, travelers unfolding maps, lives quietly unfolding beyond the reach of his eyes. He had never met most of them, yet somehow they had always felt like neighbors. He hoped today would be kind to them. After a moment, he picked up his mug once more and continued climbing. The lantern room
was waiting. Morning sunlight poured through the great panes of glass that surrounded the room, filling it with a warm, golden glow. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. From here, the world always seemed quieter. Not because there was less sound, but because there was more distance. The worries of yesterday rarely climbed this high. At the center of the room stood the great Fresnel lens. Its tall glass panels caught the morning light and scattered it into delicate ribbons across the wooden floor. Visitors often admired its beauty. Elias admired its purpose. He rested his hand lightly against the polished brass surrounding the lens. "Good morning," he whispered. Whether he was greeting the lantern, the lighthouse, or simply another day, even he could no longer say. Beside the lens waited a folded cloth, a small tin of polish, and the well-worn brush whose wooden handle had become smooth after decades of faithful use. Each rested exactly where it belonged. Some mornings, Elias imagined that moving them elsewhere would confuse the lighthouse itself. He smiled at the thought. Taking up the cloth, he began his work. Slow circles, gentle pressure. Every pane deserved the same care as the one before it. Ships would never know whether the glass had been polished with patience, but Elias would know. Years ago, a young volunteer once asked why he spent so much time cleaning places no one would ever notice. Elias had thought for a moment before answering. Because someone, somewhere, is trusting that I did. The young man had nodded politely. Elias wasn't certain he had understood. That was all right. Some lessons arrived only after enough years had passed. As the cloth glided across the glass, another memory quietly found him. Anna had often climbed the stairs carrying 2 cups of tea balanced carefully on a wooden tray. She would set them beside the window before watching him polish the lens with unwavering concentration. No one's inspecting it with a magnifying glass, she used to tease. Without looking up, Elias would smile. Maybe not. Then why polish every corner? His answer never changed. Because the ships trust that someone did. Anna would laugh softly. That's such an Elias answer. Then, just to make him smile, she would pick up the second cloth and begin polishing the opposite side with exaggerated seriousness. For a few wonderful minutes, they always finished twice as quickly. He quietly laughed to himself. Somehow, even after all these years, he had never managed to finish that quickly again. Outside, a lone gull landed upon the iron railing circling the lantern room. It tilted its head toward Elias, then toward the freshly polished glass. He looked back at it with equal seriousness. Inspection day again? The gull answered with a single sharp cry. I thought as much. The bird remained where it was, watching, waiting, as though perfectly satisfied that everything was exactly as it ought to be.
the last pane had been polished, Elias folded the cloth neatly across his palm before returning it to its place beside the tin of polish. Everything had its home: the cloth, the brush, the lantern wicks, even memories. Near the base of the great lens stood a small oak cabinet, its brass handle worn smooth by years of careful hands. Inside were weather journals dating back decades, spare parts for the lantern, bottles of oil, and a shallow drawer that Elias opened only a handful of times each year. Today felt like one of those mornings. He drew the drawer open slowly. Resting inside was a single weathered envelope. Its corners had softened with age. The paper had yellowed slightly, though it remained carefully protected from the light. Across the front, stamped in faded crimson ink, were 3 words: "Return to sender." Elias lifted the envelope with both hands, not because it was fragile, because it was precious. Inside remained the letter exactly as he had written it 21 years before. He had spent nearly an entire afternoon choosing those words, not because they were difficult to write, but because he wanted every sentence to carry kindness. There were no apologies waiting to be accepted, no blame waiting to be answered, only simple things: that Anna's flowers were blooming again, that the lighthouse still stood faithfully above the sea, that he hoped Thomas was warm, that he hoped he was happy, and that, should he ever wish to come home, the light would always be waiting. Weeks later, the letter returned exactly as it had left. No forwarding address, no explanation, just 3 quiet words: "Return to sender." For many years, Elias wondered whether he should write another. He never did, not because hope had disappeared, but because he no longer knew where hope should be sent. Very carefully, he returned the envelope to its resting place. He closed the drawer with gentle hands until the latch settled into place with its familiar, quiet click. "There now," he whispered. Outside, the gull gave a single approving cry. Elias smiled. "I know." The afternoon would pass much as every afternoon before it had passed. There would be windows to check, brass to polish, weather to record. Small tasks that few people would ever notice. He had never minded that. Some work was valuable precisely because no one thought about it. If the light shone each evening, ships found their way home. That was enough. And tomorrow, as long as morning found the lighthouse once again, he would climb these same stairs, just as he always had, just as he always hoped to. The afternoon slipped quietly toward evening. The sun lowered itself a little closer to the horizon, painting the sea in soft shades of amber and gold. The lighthouse changed with the light. The warm brightness of morning gave way to longer shadows that stretched gently across the worn wooden floors. Elias had always loved this hour most. Morning belonged to beginnings. Evening belonged to promises. He made one final walk around the lantern room,
checking each window, each latch, and each polished pane of glass. Everything was ready, as it always had been, as it always would be. Outside, the wind had softened. The waves rolled steadily against the rocks below with the same patient rhythm they had carried for generations. Far out upon the water, a single fishing boat made its slow journey toward the harbour. Elias rested both hands upon the railing and watched it for a while. Distance had a curious way of making every boat look familiar. He found himself hoping the crew had enjoyed calm seas. He hoped someone would be waiting for them at home. Then, almost without thinking, he smiled. Home meant something different to everyone. For some, it was a place. For others, it was a person. And sometimes, if one was fortunate, it could be both. The evening breeze carried the scent of salt through the open windows. Somewhere below, the gull called once before settling onto its favourite stretch of weathered fence overlooking the sea. "You're early," Elias said with a quiet smile. The bird answered only by ruffling its feathers against the wind. Fair enough. The room slowly dimmed as the sun slipped beneath the horizon. Without hurry, Elias moved toward the great Fresnel lens. His hands knew every lever, every latch, every familiar motion. For 50 years they had repeated this quiet ritual, not because anyone was watching, but because someone, somewhere, would be depending on its light. With practiced care, he brought the beacon to life. At first, only a warm glow. Then, slowly, the great lens gathered the light and sent it sweeping out across the darkening sea. The beam reached far beyond the cliffs, far beyond the harbour, far beyond where Elias's eyes could follow. He watched it complete its first quiet circle, then another, then another. The lighthouse had always asked only one thing of him: keep the light burning. He had done his best. He hoped it had been enough. Outside, the fishing boat continued toward shore, growing smaller as evening gathered around it. Elias stood in comfortable silence. The gull remained upon the fence. The beacon continued its endless watch. Everything felt exactly as it should. Before turning to leave, Elias rested one hand against the cool brass surrounding the lantern. "Safe travels," he whispered. Whether he spoke to the sailors crossing the sea, to strangers finding their way home, or to someone beyond the horizon, whom he still carried quietly in his heart, even Elias could no longer say. He smiled once more before beginning the slow walk down the spiral staircase. Tomorrow morning, the flowers would be waiting. So would the kettle, the sea, the lighthouse, and hope, as they always had, as they always would. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. I hope this story brought you a little peace, a little hope, and a moment of quiet before sleep. If you'd like to return for another journey, I'd love to have you back. Until next time, Sleep well. May your dreams be full of wonder.